In this video, we'll provide a brief introduction to Chapter 7 in the volume entitled Introduction to Biblical Interpretation. Chapter 7 deals with general rules of hermeneutics as pertaining to prose. Chapter 8 will deal with general rules pertaining to poetry. This chapter addresses four main areas: literary context, historical cultural background, word meanings, and grammatical structural relationships. Let's begin with literary context. One of the major points in the section entitled Literary Context is to stress how vital it is to look around a passage in order to understand what it means. This principle holds true for any literature and consequently is vital for sound interpretation of the Bible. The concept of circles of context is useful. Notice the diagram on page 301 where circles radiate outwards from your core focal text, eventually reaching all the way out to the other testament. So if you're in a New Testament passage, your most remote context would be the Old Testament. That's a very broad reach. But study that diagram so you get a sense of how we try to interpret a passage responsibly by comparing it with and studying it in context, not just of a few verses around it, but its own chapters around it, the book within which it's found, other books by the same author, so that if you're reading one thing by Paul, you want to be somewhat familiar with what else Paul has written. And then the same testament, so if you're in one New Testament passage, have a general notion of where the New Testament message as a whole is going. And then finally, the other testament. It doesn't mean you have to read through the Old Testament entirely every time you preach one New Testament passage, but you want to have an awareness of the theology of it, the main points, what God is trying to get done through the Old Testament, and a New Testament passage should be viewed in that light. Already you have worked with the skill of logical outlining. When you come to the bottom of 301, as they talk about immediate context, and then turn the page, you will find an introduction to structural relationships. This gives some concrete form to the concepts that you've worked with, the skill you've developed in logical outlining, so that the list of types of logical material on 303 will make sense to you when you think about trying to trace the flow of thought and understand what a given portion of a passage contributes to its overall reach. The section on historical cultural background will remind you of some of the first sort of observations that you began making in this course, historical observations. So the discussion on these pages will give you the rationale for why that is so important. Of particular value is a statement towards the top of page 317 under Original Impact. They write, quote, "We must determine the impact that the biblical message would have had in its original setting. File this note away for the future when we come to formulating applications, because a first step in crafting a modern application is to back up and imagine what sort of application might have been appropriate for the original hearers of a passage. We will use our imagination at that point to try and think what kind of impact and what kind of change may the Holy Spirit have intended from a passage with its first audience, and then we'll extrapolate forward in time to our current setting. We're going to want a degree of congruence between those two, allowing, of course, for changes in culture and surroundings, but there should be a timeless message that will fit. That's part of the importance of this exhortation on the top of 317. The section entitled Word Meanings has some excellent information concerning the value of studying individual words and also a responsible way to move through a word study. In this course, we'll be coming to a word study project a little bit later. When you do so, this is a good part of the textbook to return to, both for steps and also for resources that can open up word meanings to you, whether you are working strictly in the English Bible or when you have access through the Hebrew or Greek. This is an excellent reference volume. Under the heading Grammatical Structural Relationships, please pay particular attention to page 352. You'll notice the heading there, Flow of Thought. This corresponds very closely, again, to the skill that you've been recently developing in logical outlines. Logical outlines are a study of the flow of thought or the progression of thought in a passage. Once again, this is vital because we presume that the writers were not just dropping individual verses willy-nilly, putting them into a hat, stirring it around, and then coming up with first verse out of the hat is verse 1, second verse out of the hat is verse 2. You don't communicate that way. Neither did they. They put things in order to make a point. On pages 352 and 353, you can see some careful analysis of verses or portions of verses. The objective there is to surface the phrases within a verse that are primary, and then to demote those phrases that are supportive or secondary. That helps us to major on the majors. When you come to pages 354 and 355, you will probably find yourself in familiar territory, since this analyzes how various questions are answered, what kinds of questions are answered by given information. What are some of the options? Sometimes, as we have introduced logical outlining, we have said, what information does this provide? A given phrase. So interrogate in a sense the passage to say, what information are you providing? Are you giving me a statement, a backup rationale, a contrastive opposite? Again, notice the kinds of information, the categories that are shown on these pages, and train yourself to analyze passages in order to understand the flow of information. Notice on 357 the word connectives. Here they will talk about how important it is to notice if the passage itself provides us with information that says, how does this verse connect to or relate to what precedes or perhaps what follows? As a sidelight, when I have pushed you to insert connectives in your logical outlines, I pushed you to listen for the tone, the development, even if an explicit connective was not present in the biblical material. Just by virtue of hearing that one verse is talking about hot and the next verse is talking about cold, you can infer that the connective is contrast. This passage is going to help you cultivate that ability, but it is limited. The textbook here is largely limiting you to explicit connectives. I encourage you to start with that. Those are the obvious ones. That's the low-hanging fruit. But be aware that not all passages announce the connectives, the seams, or the joints between one section and another. Sometimes they are not announced explicitly, rather they are implicit, and we must infer from them what's the relationship. That can be very fruitful. We have to be careful that we infer on good evidence, but it still can be very fruitful and can help an otherwise static passage really come to life. The fact that this chapter is addressing prose indicates really an unstated assumption that we begin by discerning what genre, what type of literature we are in, because chapter 8 will deal with poetry. So from the get-go, we've got to establish, are we working in prose or are we working in poetry? Granted, many of the skills in prose that you've learned here in chapter 7 do pertain to poetry. Poetry has a more unique set which do not cross back over into prose. Later chapters will zero in respectively on genres particular to the Old Testament and genres particular to the New Testament. Our textbook begins in the general level by simply distinguishing prose and poetry.